December 22nd, 1944. A frozen foxhole near the village of Foy, Belgium. Private First Class Thomas "Tommy" Brennan crouched in the darkness, his fingers so cold he could barely feel the metal cylinder in his hands. Ahead of him, through the skeletal trees of the Ardennes forest, 14 German tanks were advancing toward the American line. Panzers and Panthers, their engines rumbling like thunder, their guns seeking targets in the pre-dawn gloom. The American anti-tank guns had been destroyed 2 days earlier. The bazooka teams were out of ammunition. The artillery support that should have stopped this assault had been cut off when the Germans overran the supply depot at Noville. There was nothing between Tommy's platoon and those 14 tanks except rifles, grenades, and whatever courage remained in men who had been fighting without sleep for 5 days straight. Nothing except Tommy's soup cans. He had spent the last 3 weeks collecting empty cans from the mess tent, filling them with a mixture of gasoline and motor oil, wrapping them with strips of cloth soaked in the same mixture, and attaching simple fuses made from bootlaces and match heads. The other soldiers had laughed at him. They had called his creations Brennan's breakfast bombs, and asked if he was planning to feed the Germans to death. But Tommy had not been joking. He had grown up in the coal mining towns of West Virginia, where men learned to improvise explosives because their lives depended on it. He knew that fire was the one thing that tanks feared, that the crews inside those steel coffins were terrified of burning, that even the mighty Panther could be stopped by flames that found their way into engine compartments and ammunition stores. The lead tank was 200 yards away now, 150, 100. Tommy lit the first fuse and waited for the Panzer to pass his position. He had calculated this moment 100 times in his mind, had practiced the throw with rocks and empty bottles, had studied the tank's vulnerabilities in whatever manuals he could find. The Panzer rolled past, its commander buttoned up against the cold, its crew blind to the American soldier hiding in the shadows beside the road. Tommy threw. The soup can arced through the darkness and landed on the engine deck of the Panzer, exactly where he had aimed. The fuse caught the gasoline mixture, and the tank erupted in flames that shot 20 feet into the air. And Tommy Brennan, the coal miner's son, who everyone had laughed at, was already lighting his second soup can. If you are watching from anywhere in the world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We bring you stories from World War II that reveal what happens when ordinary soldiers refuse to accept impossible situations, when one man's unconventional thinking changes everything. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. These stories survive because we remember them together. Thomas Patrick Brennan was born in 1923 in the coal town of Welch, West Virginia, deep in the McDowell County hills, where the mountains pressed so close together that the sun only reached the valley floor for a few hours each day. His father, Patrick Brennan, was a coal miner who had come from Ireland as a young man, fleeing the poverty of County Cork for the promised opportunity of America, and spent the next 30 years burrowing into the earth for wages that barely kept his family fed. The Brennan family lived in a company house on a muddy street, lined with identical houses, all owned by the same mining corporation. They bought their food at the company store, where prices were higher than anywhere else, but credit was freely extended against future wages. They owed their souls to the mining corporation that owned everything in Welch except the sky. And sometimes, when the coal smoke hung thick in the valley, it seemed like they owned that too. It was a hard life, dangerous and poorly paid, but it was the only life that Tommy knew. He grew up with coal dust in his lungs and calluses on his hands before he was 10 years old, learning the trade that had sustained his family for generations. His mother tried to keep him in school, tried to give him a chance at something better, but the mines needed young backs and strong hands, and the family needed every dollar they could earn. Coal mining in the 1930s was a brutal profession that killed men slowly with dust and gas, or quickly with cave-ins and explosions. The seams were narrow and unstable, sometimes only 3 feet high, forcing men to work on their hands and knees for entire shifts. The equipment was primitive and poorly maintained, prone to failures that could trap men underground for hours or days. The companies cared more about production than safety, pushing crews to work faster and longer, cutting corners on ventilation and support beams. Men died regularly, crushed by cave-ins that came without warning, poisoned by bad air that accumulated in poorly ventilated tunnels, killed by explosions that ripped through the passages with the force of artillery shells. Tommy attended his first funeral when he was 6 years old, watching as the entire town gathered to bury 3 miners who had been killed by a methane explosion in shaft number 7. He saw the widows weeping, the children who would never see their fathers again, the grim acceptance in the faces of men who knew they might be next. But the mines also taught Tommy something that would save his life years later. In a frozen forest on the other side of the world, how to work with explosives. Blasting was essential to coal mining, the only way to break through the rock that surrounded the coal seams. The seams were often too hard to dig by hand, embedded in stone that would take days to chip away with picks and shovels. Dynamite was the answer. Properly placed charges that could crack the rock and expose the coal, allowing the miners to extract what they had come for. The blasters were the elite of the mining world, men who understood the chemistry and physics of explosives, who could calculate exactly how much charge was needed to crack a seam without bringing down the entire tunnel, who could read the rock and predict how it would fracture. Tommy's father was a blaster, one of the best in McDowell County, and from the time Tommy was old enough to carry a toolbox, trudging along behind his father into the darkness of the mines, he learned the trade that had made Patrick Brennan valuable enough to survive 30 years underground. He learned that explosives were not magic. They were chemistry. The right combination of fuel and oxidizer, properly contained and properly ignited, could accomplish anything. He learned that fire was often more dangerous than the initial blast, that secondary explosions could be triggered by heat reaching stored materials. He learned to respect the power he was working with, while also understanding that power could be controlled. Most importantly, he learned to improvise. The mining companies rarely provided enough equipment, and the blasters learned to work with whatever materials were available. If they ran out of commercial fuse, they made their own from cotton cord and black powder. If the dynamite was wet and unreliable, they found alternatives. The ability to solve problems with inadequate resources was not just a skill, it was a survival requirement. By the time Tommy was 16, he was working alongside his father in the mines, earning a man's wages and doing a man's work. By 18, he was a qualified blaster in his own right, trusted to handle explosives that could kill everyone in the tunnel if he made a mistake. When the war came in 1941, Tommy enlisted immediately. He was 20 years old, strong from years of underground labor, and possessed of skills that the army would find extremely useful, though not in the way anyone expected. Tommy Brennan expected to be assigned to an engineering unit when he enlisted. His experience with explosives, his knowledge of demolition, his understanding of confined spaces and structural weaknesses, all of these seemed perfectly suited for the combat engineers who would blow bridges and clear minefields, who would use explosives the way he had used them in the mines. Instead, he was assigned to the infantry. The Army's classification system was vast and impersonal, a bureaucratic machine that processed millions of men based on tests and questionnaires that could not capture the nuances of individual experience. Tommy scored well on the general aptitude tests, but had no formal education beyond 8th grade. The mines had claimed him before he could finish school. His mining experience was noted in his file, but not flagged as particularly relevant to any military specialty. He was young, healthy, and capable of carrying a rifle. That was enough for the infantry, which always needed more bodies. Tommy did not complain. He had learned in the mines that complaining accomplished nothing except making the bosses angry and marking you as a troublemaker. You did your job, you kept your head down, and you found ways to solve problems with whatever resources you had. The army was just another kind of mine, with different tunnels and different dangers, but the same basic rules. Obey orders, stay alive, and figure things out for yourself when the system failed you. He went through basic training at Camp Wheeler in Georgia, learning to march and shoot and take orders. He was not the best soldier in his company, but he was far from the worst. His instructors noted his quiet competence and recommended him for promotion to private first class. In June 1944, Tommy shipped out to England as part of the massive build-up for the invasion of France. He arrived in Normandy 3 weeks after D-Day, joining a company that had been decimated in the fighting around Carentan. The survivors welcomed him with the wary indifference of men who had learned not to get attached to replacements. Tommy kept his head down and watched. He paid attention to how the veterans moved, how they read the terrain, how they anticipated danger before it arrived. He asked questions when questions were welcome and shut up when they were not. He made himself useful in the small ways that earned respect, carrying extra ammunition, helping dig foxholes, sharing his rations with men who had lost theirs. And he started thinking about tanks. The hedgerow country of Normandy was murder on infantry, but the German tanks were what truly terrified the American soldiers. The Panther and the Tiger were vastly superior to anything the Americans fielded, better armored, better armed, better designed in almost every way that mattered. When German armor appeared, American infantry could only dig in and pray that their own tanks would arrive in time, or that the tank destroyers would find a good angle, or that somehow the Germans would simply go away. Tommy watched several engagements between American and German armor, and he noticed something that the other soldiers seemed to overlook in their terror. The German tanks were vulnerable to fire. When a tank caught fire, whether from an anti-tank round that ignited the fuel or from a Molotov cocktail thrown by a desperate infantryman, the crew almost always abandoned it immediately, often before the fire had done any serious damage. The fear of burning alive was stronger than any other fear, stronger even than the fear of enemy fire. The problem was getting close enough to use fire against tanks. Molotov cocktails required the thrower to approach within a few yards of the target. Most attempts ended with dead Americans and undamaged tanks. But Tommy had an idea. He remembered the lessons his father had taught him about incendiary materials, about fuel mixtures that burned hotter and longer than simple gasoline, about improvised fuses that could be timed to give the thrower a chance to escape. He started experimenting. The experiments began in September 1944, during the relatively quiet weeks after the breakout from Normandy, when the Allied armies were racing across France so quickly that the combat units often had little to do but wait for the supply lines to catch up. Tommy collected empty soup cans from the mess tent, the large institutional cans that had held vegetables or condensed milk or whatever else the army was serving that week. The cans were the perfect size for throwing, heavy enough to fly true, but light enough to be hurled a reasonable distance. They were sturdy enough to survive the impact of landing on armor plate, and they were everywhere, discarded by the thousands after every meal, piled in garbage pits that no one paid any attention to. He experimented with different fuel mixtures, working in secret during the hours when most soldiers were sleeping or playing cards. Pure gasoline burned quickly, but sometimes extinguished before doing significant damage. The flame was hot but brief, easily snuffed by the wind or the cold metal of a tank's hull. Motor oil burned longer, but was harder to ignite, requiring sustained heat before it would catch. A mixture of the two, roughly 3 parts gasoline to 1 part oil, produced flames that were both easy to light and persistent enough to cause real harm, clinging to metal surfaces and finding their way into cracks and vents. The fusing was trickier. Tommy needed something that would burn slowly enough to give him time to throw the can, but reliably enough that it would not go out in flight. He tried various materials before settling on a simple solution. Bootlaces soaked in gasoline and coated with match head shavings. The bootlace would smolder for approximately 5 seconds after being lit, then ignite the main fuel mixture. The other soldiers watched Tommy's experiments with amusement that gradually turned to mockery as the weeks passed, and his obsession showed no signs of fading. They called his creations Brennan's breakfast bombs and soup can specials and Welch's wonder weapons. They asked if he was planning to feed the Germans to death, if he had finally cracked from the stress, if his mother had dropped him on his head as a baby. They suggested that maybe he should focus on shooting straight instead of playing with fire like a child. Tommy ignored them. He had heard similar mockery in the mines when his father tried new blasting techniques that the old-timers thought were foolish, when young men suggested improvements that experienced miners dismissed as dangerous innovations. The mockery meant nothing. Only results mattered, and Tommy was confident in his results. The opportunity to prove himself came in October during the fighting around the Dutch town of Wegel. Tommy's company was holding a roadblock when 3 German tanks appeared. The American anti-tank weapons scored 1 hit, but failed to stop the lead tank. Tommy grabbed 2 of his soup cans and worked his way along a drainage ditch that ran parallel to the road. He got within 30 yards of the second tank without being spotted. He lit the first fuse, counted to 3 and threw. The can landed on the engine deck of the Panzer IV, exactly where he had aimed. The flames spread across the rear of the tank, finding the cooling vents, the vulnerable points where fire could reach the interior. The crew bailed out within seconds. The third tank retreated, unwilling to face whatever weapon had destroyed its companion. Tommy had proved his concept. Now he needed to prove it could work at scale. The German offensive that became known as the Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944, shattering the quiet of a front that everyone had assumed was stable. The Ardennes sector was considered a rest area, a place where exhausted divisions could recover and green divisions could get acclimated to combat without facing major enemy action. The German attack shattered that assumption with the force of a hammer blow. 25 German divisions, including several armored formations that had been rebuilt in secret, struck the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest with a fury that no one had anticipated. The offensive was Hitler's last gamble, a desperate attempt to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West before the inevitable collapse of the Eastern Front. Tommy's unit was not in the initial impact zone, but within days they were rushed to the front to help contain the breakthrough. The fighting was chaotic and brutal, with German armor punching through American lines and encircling entire units. The weather was terrible. Freezing rain, heavy snow, fog so thick that the Allied aircraft that might have stopped the tanks were grounded on their airfields. And there were so many tanks. The Germans had concentrated their remaining armor for this offensive, and it seemed like Panzers and Panthers were everywhere, grinding through the forest roads, crushing American positions, appearing out of the fog like steel ghosts. American anti-tank units were overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. Bazookas ran out of rockets. Artillery positions were overrun before they could fire. The infantry was left to face German armor with nothing but rifles and courage and whatever improvisation they could manage. Tommy found himself in a foxhole near the village of Foy, part of a hastily assembled defensive line trying to protect the town of Bastogne. His company had lost half its strength in 3 days of fighting, but Tommy had his soup cans. He had spent every spare moment preparing for exactly this situation. He had filled 3 dozen cans with his gasoline oil mixture. He had prepared fuses for each one. He had identified the best throwing positions along the road. On the night of December 22nd, the Germans launched another assault. 14 tanks emerged from the forest, grinding toward the American line. The few remaining American anti-tank weapons opened fire and achieved nothing. Captain Morrison ordered a withdrawal. There was no way to stop 14 tanks with rifles and empty bazookas. Tommy did not withdraw. He grabbed his bag of soup cans and worked his way forward, using the darkness and the smoke to mask his movement. The German tanks were advancing in column, following the narrow road through the forest. They were buttoned up against the cold, their vision limited. Tommy reached a position beside the road in a shell crater. He waited as the lead tank rolled past. He lit his first fuse and threw. The first Panzer died in a column of fire that lit up the night like a signal beacon, visible for miles through the frozen forest. Tommy's can had landed exactly where he intended, on the engine deck, behind the turret, where the armor was thinnest and the fuel was closest to the surface. The flames spread faster than he had expected, probably because the freezing temperatures had made the engine run hot and the fuel lines pressurized, probably because the crew had been running the motor constantly to keep from freezing to death in their steel coffin. The crew tried to escape, scrambling for the hatches as the heat built inside the tank, but the fire was already inside the hull, spreading through vents and cracks that the designers had never imagined would admit an enemy. The ammunition began to cook off, explosions rippling through the tank's interior, and Tommy heard screaming, a sound he would never forget, a sound that would visit him in nightmares for the rest of his life. The second tank stopped, its commander trying to understand what had just happened to the vehicle in front of him. The German infantry began to deploy, spreading out into the darkness, searching for the anti-tank weapon that must have destroyed the lead vehicle. They looked for a bazooka team, for an anti-tank gun, for something that made sense. But there was no anti-tank weapon to find, just a 21-year-old coal miner's son with a bag full of soup cans and the knowledge his father had given him. Tommy moved to a new position, circling through the darkness to approach the column from a different angle. He had learned in the mines that you never worked the same spot twice. The rock would be weakened, the enemy would be watching. The element of surprise would be gone. He lit his second can and threw. This one landed on the second tank, a panther that had been trying to push past the burning wreck of the Panzer. The flames caught the external fuel cans that German crews often carried strapped to their tanks, extra range for long operations, but also a vulnerability that Tommy had counted on when he developed his technique. The Panther erupted like a bomb, the external fuel igniting all at once, turning the tank into an inferno that no crew could survive. 3 tanks now. 4, if you counted the one that was trying to reverse away from the flames. The Germans were beginning to panic, their confidence shattered by an enemy they could not see, could not understand, could not fight. Tommy continued to move and throw, using the confusion and the darkness to his advantage. The German infantry could not find him. They were looking for a bazooka team or an anti-tank gun, not a single man with improvised weapons. The tank commanders were buttoning up, afraid of snipers, which made them even more vulnerable to fire weapons that they could not see coming until it was too late. The 4th tank. The 5th, the 6th, the 7th. Some of the cans missed their targets or landed in places where the flames could not spread, on the turret where the armor was thick, on the ground beside the treads. But enough of them hit, and the ones that hit burned with a fury that the German crews could not extinguish, that spread and grew until the tanks became their own funeral pyres. By midnight, 8 tanks were burning. The German assault had stalled. Tommy had run out of soup cans, but the company had time to reorganize its defense. He crawled back to the American lines as dawn broke. Captain Morrison was waiting for him. The final count: 14 German tanks destroyed or disabled in a single night. Not all were Tommy's work. Artillery and a tank destroyer team had helped, but at least 8 of the kills belonged to the coal miner's son. The men who had mocked him would never mock him again. The Battle of the Bulge continued for another month, but the German offensive was already dying by Christmas Day. The weather cleared on December 23rd, allowing Allied aircraft to devastate the German supply lines and attack the armored columns that had penetrated so deep into American territory. Reinforcements poured into the Ardennes from all directions. Bastogne was relieved. The tanks that had seemed so unstoppable were running out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of hope. Tommy survived the battle, though he was wounded in January by shell fragments that tore into his left arm and would leave scars for the rest of his life. He refused evacuation, staying with his unit until the fighting was over, until the last German offensive of the war had been crushed. He was awarded the Silver Star for his actions on the night of December 22nd, the citation describing in formal military language how he had single-handedly disabled multiple enemy armored vehicles using improvised incendiary weapons, displaying exceptional courage and resourcefulness in the face of overwhelming enemy force. The citation did not mention soup cans. Some things were too strange for official military documents. Some things had to be seen to be believed. Tommy was promoted to sergeant and transferred to a training unit, where his job was to teach other soldiers the techniques he had developed. The Brennan method of improvised anti-tank warfare was never officially adopted. The army preferred to rely on purpose-built weapons, but the knowledge spread through the ranks, passed from soldier to soldier in the way that practical knowledge always spreads in combat units. The war ended in May 1945. Tommy shipped home in September, arriving in West Virginia to find that his father had died while he was overseas. A heart attack, the doctor said, probably brought on by 30 years of breathing coal dust in the mines. Patrick Brennan had never known that his son had survived the Ardennes, had never known that the lessons he taught in the darkness of the mines had been used in the darkness of a frozen forest, had never known that his boy had destroyed 14 tanks with techniques learned in the coal seams of McDowell County. Tommy did not go back to mining. He could not face the tunnels again, could not breathe the dust that had killed his father, could not return to the world he had left behind. He used his veterans' benefits to attend trade school, becoming an electrician and eventually starting his own contracting business in Charleston. He married a woman named Margaret, who had worked in a defense plant during the war, building the same kinds of weapons that Tommy had improvised. and together they raised 3 children in a modest house on a hill overlooking the Kanawha River. He rarely spoke about the war. When his children asked about his service, he told them only that he had done what was necessary, that he had been lucky to survive, that the real heroes were the men who did not come home. The soup cans, the burning tanks, the night in the Ardennes. These stories remained private, shared only with Margaret in quiet moments when the memories demanded to be spoken and the nightmares refused to stay silent. But the lesson of the Ardennes stayed with him for the rest of his life. Every problem had a solution. Every obstacle could be overcome. The resources you needed were almost always available. You just had to see them differently, to recognize the potential hidden in things that others dismissed as worthless. An empty soup can was just garbage, something to be thrown away and forgotten. Unless you understood chemistry and physics, unless you had grown up learning to improvise in the coal mines of West Virginia, unless you refused to accept that a problem was impossible just because the conventional solutions had failed, then an empty soup can became something else entirely. Then it became a weapon that could destroy a tank. In 1987, a military historian researching improvised weapons in World War II tracked Tommy down at his home in Charleston. The historian had found references to the soup can bomb in several veteran accounts and wanted to interview the man who had invented the technique. Tommy agreed reluctantly. He was 64 years old, his hair white, his hands scarred from decades of electrical work. The war seemed like another lifetime, another person's experience, something that had happened to a young man who no longer existed. The interview lasted 4 hours. Tommy explained the technique in detail, the fuel mixture, the fusing, the tactics for approaching tanks in darkness. He described the night of December 22nd, the cold so bitter that his fingers barely worked, the burning panzers lighting up the forest, the screaming of men who could not escape the flames. He talked about his father and the lessons of the mines, about the mockery he had endured, about the moment when everything he had prepared for came together in 11 seconds of fire and destruction. At the end of the interview, the historian asked the question that everyone eventually asked when they heard the story. How did it feel to destroy 14 tanks with soup cans? Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, looking at something the historian could not see. It felt like coming home, he said finally. Everything I learned in those mines, the chemistry, the improvisation, the way you solve problems when no one will help you, it all came together in that moment. The other soldiers saw empty cans. I saw weapons. That's what my father taught me. You don't accept limitations. You find ways around them. You use what you have. And when everyone tells you it's impossible, you prove them wrong. He paused, his voice roughening with emotion he had spent 40 years learning to control. I think about those German crews sometimes, the ones who burned. They were just soldiers like us, following orders, trying to survive. I don't know if what I did was heroic or horrible, maybe both. But I know this. I did what I had to do to keep my friends alive, and I'd do it again. He died in 2001 at the age of 78, peacefully in his sleep. His children buried him in the cemetery overlooking Welch, next to his father and mother, in the valley where he had learned everything that had kept him alive in the Ardennes. The headstone read, "He found a way." The soup can technique was never officially adopted by any military, but it appeared in various forms in conflicts around the world. In Korea, in Vietnam, in countless guerrilla wars where men with limited resources faced armored enemies. They had mocked his soup can bombs. They had called them ridiculous, childish, the fantasy of a man who did not understand modern warfare and should have stuck to digging coal in the mountains of West Virginia. And then they had watched him destroy 14 German tanks in a single night, using nothing but empty cans and gasoline and the lessons he had learned from his father in the coal mines, lessons about chemistry and physics, about improvisation and determination, about never accepting that a problem was impossible just because everyone else said so. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments what touched you most, and tell us where you are watching from today. These stories survive when we remember them together, and together, we ensure that the ingenuity of ordinary soldiers who found ways when there were none is never forgotten, never lost to the passage of time. The men who laughed at Tommy Brennan were not fools. They were soldiers who trusted conventional weapons, who followed standard procedures, who believed that military problems required military solutions designed by military experts. Their skepticism was reasonable and understandable. But Tommy understood something different, something his father had taught him in the mines of West Virginia, something about chemistry and physics and the power of seeing potential where others saw only garbage. Every problem has a solution. Every limitation can be overcome. And when you are out of options, when the conventional answers have failed, and the experts say there is nothing to be done, you make new options out of whatever you have. That is what Tommy Brennan proved in the frozen forests of the Ardennes on the night of December 22nd, 1944. That is what we should remember today. That is the lesson of the soup can bombs.